So when I trim my books, I do like to make sure that all the way around I get a nice even edge. I have these steel rules. They're a fantastic tool. You can get them from Talus or Hollanders. They're bookbinding supply companies. What this does is just allow me to make my turn-ins really nice, neat, and clean. You don't have to do this. Your book will still work. It also just makes it a little bit easier to work with, though, because you don't have any edge that's really long or really short. So I just use that. I lay it right on the edge of the book board. It bumps up against it, and I trim the paper off. I'm going to do that going all the way around. Bumping it up against the edge of the book board, making my trim. Just trimming. So here we go. We've got our book. We've got a nice even turn-in all the way around. So now I'm going to go ahead and trim the corners. Got nice even edges all the way around. And I'm going to cut the corners because it reduces the bulk so that when I'm ready to turn in, which I'm going to do by literally turning in my paper, it gets rid of some of that and moves it out of my way. What I'll do is I'll cut at about a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to leave, you'll see, roughly about an eighth of an inch or so, a little bit wider right there between the corner of the book board and the edge of the paper. Because if I cut too close and I cut right up on the corner of the book board will actually show through when I make my fold. If I leave it too wide, it can get bulky and it can get in my way. I'm going to do that on all four corners. You can do this using a straight edge. It makes it more exact. This will work to just use scissors. And get my trimmings out of the way. So now I've got my nice even edges. I've got my cut corners. And I'm ready to do my turn-in. I'm going to take my glue sheet, make sure it's nice and dry and clean. Be really depressing at this point to get glue where I don't want it. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn in the long edges first. So I'm going to apply really a thin layer of glue. I don't want it to dry out on me before I'm done, but I also really don't want it to be gloppy or to squeeze out of the edge of the paper when I fold it up. And I'm going to show you a couple different methods for completing the turn-in. Do what works best for you, what makes the most sense. The first method is that once I've glued up my edge, what I'm going to do is actually turn the book on its edges, pressing it down into the mat and then flipping it all the way over, sort of pressing it again. And then I'll come along with my bone folder and just sort of check on that, make sure it's nice and even right up flush against the board. You don't want there to be little peaks and valleys up here where the paper didn't get pressed onto the board. And then I'll do the same thing on this side, just making sure it's nice and smashed down flat. I don't worry about the center part, making sure it's sticking to the spine cloth in there. That's fine. It's not really a concern. So now I'm going to do the other side. Again, got my glue sheet, making sure it's nice and dry. Light layer of glue all along this long edge. If you're struggling with the method of flipping it over, what you can do is take your bone folder and work the edges, just kind of pressing it down and then pushing it over. I find this method to be slower and a little more tedious, and I have good results with the other version, so that's what I do primarily, but this is a good way to just make sure, again, the paper is always flush, pressed right up against that board. You don't want any gapping to happen. Okay, so now I've got my long edges turned in, and what I'm going to do now is get ready to pinch in my corners and turn the short edges. But before I can just do the same thing I did with the long edges, I actually have this bulk paper up here, and I need to pinch it in a little bit. This is tricky to see, but I'll get as best I can. I'm just really taking my thumb and pushing it in. So if you see, that's the pinched in example, that's the flat example where we started. I'll do that there. Same thing on this end. I'm just going to pinch it in a little bit. And that'll help make sure that the paper doesn't overlap and stick out off the top. So once I've done that, got my little pinched in corners, I'm going to do turn-ins exactly the same as I did on the long edge. I've got my nice clean glue sheet, light layer of glue along the edge. And then I'm just gonna press that down, flip it over, just come along and double check everything with my bone folder, making sure it's nice and pressed down all the way. That side is done. Now, the other short side, nice clean glue sheet, light layer of glue, glue sheet out of the way, and I'm going to flip it, making sure it's getting nice and pressed as I turn. Clean it up with the bone folder and just press it down on the inside. Okay, so now I have a cover. I am most of the way to a book. Got my nice even turn-ins, my corners are nice and clean, and I'm ready to case in. All right, so I've gotten my text block out of the press. I've got my cover all finished up. I'm ready to case in. Now, before I get any glue out and I make any steps, I'm gonna take my text block and I'm gonna check to see if it's nestling nicely inside there. It's not sticking out on any side. And I have to admit, I have noticed that on this one, it does stick out a little along the foredge. This paper was bulkier than I expected, and I'm actually glad this happened because it could happen to you and I want you to know what to do. I thought it would work, and I didn't need to add any more to my spine gap, but I should have added a little bit more. This is a1/2 inch. I might have gone up to 3/4 of an inch to make sure it would fit nicely. The good news is though, if this happens to you, all is not lost. What I'm gonna do is I'm actually just gonna trim a little bit off the foredge of my book so it'll fit in there a little bit more neatly. I think what really caused my problem here was the creep. We've talked about that before. When you fold the paper, it pushes out and gets an unevenness to it because of the space it has to occupy. So, trimming your text block can be tricky. You can mess it up and sort of have to start all over, but if you just take it slowly, that probably won't happen to you. With these books, they're so small that if it did, it really wouldn't be too hard for me to recreate my text block and I wouldn't have lost too much work. I've decided that what I'm going to do is trim off all of the creep, and it's going to be about 1/4 of an inch or so, maybe a little more. So what I do is I just line up my straight edges on my grid, figure out where my creep starts, line my ruler up, and again I need a sharp blade and some patience, but I'm just going to score this right on that edge over and over again until I get rid of that excess that I don't want. This is also just something you can do if you don't like the way that the creep looks. If that's bothering you with your books, you can certainly always trim the foredge. It can be tricky. You can make a mistake and cut where you don't want and sort of really get yourself into some trouble. I've done it in the past, but it is an option if you're careful while you work. If you were in a nice fancy book studio, you would probably have a guillotine cutter. It's actually mechanical and it would just slice through even a whole phone book with ease. In your house, that's probably not your situation. So I've trimmed that up. It's nice and flat. Let me just check it again before I glue anything down. And yeah, that's fitting much better. Much, much better. Okay, so now I'm ready to case in. The first thing I want to do is apply glue along the paper side of my spine wrapper. So I'm going to get out 2 glue sheets, one for the bottom, just checking them to make sure they're nice and dry. And I'm going to push this out like this. And I'm going to slide this one under the other part of the spine wrapper. And then I'm just going to apply a light layer of glue. Again, I really am always trying to work with less glue than I think I need, because you can add more, but you can't really take it away very easily. That all nice and glued up. Okay. Gonna get my glue sheets out of the way real quick so that they can't get where I don't want the glue. And now what I'm going to do is take my text block, and what I want to do is center up my spine in the spine gap. So left and right, top and bottom, I kind of want it to be right in the middle. You can eyeball that. You don't have to worry that it's got to be super, super exact. It's going to be okay, even if it's not. Won't be the end of the world. Okay, so once I do that, what I'm going to do is come along on either side and press down my piece of book cloth, my spine wrapper. And I'll probably come in with my bone folder and just work that into the spine gap, press it down onto the board, make sure it's all nice and set. And then I'm almost to my finished book. But if you take a look, you'll notice that I have this board exposed, which I don't want. So I'm going to take the next step to put down my in sheets. So I have my 2 in sheets. They are single pieces of paper. If you remember, they're about the width of the text block. And what I'm going to do is glue up everything, and then I'm just going to center them on the cover like that. Again, you'll remember I don't like to apply glue to paper any more than I absolutely have to. So I start this process by putting a layer of glue onto the book board. And I might overlap the paper and the cloth a little bit because I know it's all going to get covered, but really I just work in the part that's the exposed board. I really just want to keep that part my gluey part. Alright, so then I'm going to set that to the side for a minute. I'm going to get out my glue sheet, check it, make sure it's good and dry, unless it's a brand new one, in which case I don't have to worry about that. And then I'm going to apply, just like before, I applied a light layer of glue to the edge of my cover sheet. I'm going to do that to the in sheets, but I'm going to go all the way around, putting glue about 1/2 inch in or so on all of the edges. I'm keeping it light. I really don't want the paper to curl. That can get tricky to work with. And then I'm going to carefully pick it up, get my glue sheet out of the way, and then I'm going to lay it down. Carefully centering it up. This takes practice, so if you get it a little off kilter on your first attempts, it's really okay. You'll get it eventually. It's about just kind of getting familiar with the materials, getting familiar with the dimensions. I work with this size a lot, so I'm used to it. And just make sure that you press it down really well. If you've gotten any sort of wrinkling, you can maybe see a little bit here. I do have a little bit of bubbling happening. That typically goes away when you press it. It's just the paper has changed its sort of feeling a little bit. If you get a really big wrinkle, sometimes that does not go away, but typically little bubbles and wrinkles will disappear with drying and pressing. Okay, so now we've got 1 in sheet in. We're going to repeat the same process on the other side. So start out with a layer of glue right inside the cover. Once I've got that glued up, I'm going to set it to the side, get my glue sheet out, making sure it's nice and dry and clean. And I'm going to go ahead and put my layer of glue along all the edges of the in sheet, keeping it light, but making sure I get good coverage all the way around. Because I do want it to stick down, and if I don't do that, I might have little spaces where there's not actually enough glue to hold it down. So it's a fine balance, but you'll get there. So you can see, again, this is why I don't glue the paper any more than I have to. It immediately starts to roll up on me. So now I'm going to go ahead, lining this up along the inside, pressing it down. I try to work from the middle again to the outsides. It's always a good practice with paper. Helps avoid wrinkles you can't get rid of. Take my bone folder, work on pressing it down. Okay. And then I have my book. My next step is going to be to go ahead and put it in the press. Before I put this in the press, I'm going to want to have several brand new, fresh, clean sheets of waste paper that I can use as a pad between the covers and the text blocks. Because the glue has got a lot of moisture in there, and what I don't want to happen is for the text block pages to absorb that moisture. They'll get wrinkly and it won't go away. I've had that happen to me a number of times, and it's a frustrating problem. So what I'm going to do is go ahead, get these ready, and then you'll see I'm going to take about 2 pieces and put them in between my end sheet and my text block. I do want them to be bigger than the book so that they hang out on all the edges, because if you don't, when you press it, you might accidentally leave an imprint from the edge of the paper into the end sheet or the cover or the text block. So, got those in there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in the press or under my mattress or under a heavy stack of books, and I want to let it sit for at least overnight, at least, if not a full 24 hours. You want to have nice, good pressure. It'll tighten everything up. It'll make sure that the glue gets dried out and absorbed, and then your book will be finished.